The weight we carry. Have you ever felt like you were living in a museum of your own life? A place where every object, every photograph, every folded piece of paper holds a memory so heavy that it keeps you tethered to the past. Where the walls whisper stories of what once was, but never what could be. Thomas Carter sat in his dimly lit living room, surrounded by relics of decades gone by. Stacks of old books lined the shelves, their spines worn and untouched for years. A wooden chest in the corner overflowed with forgotten trinkets, souvenirs from trips taken long ago. On the table beside him lay a pile of letters, their edges yellowed with time. The words of a wife long past, her handwriting frozen in ink but no longer in motion. His fingers trembled as he picked up one of the letters, tracing the loops of Margaret's delicate script. He could almost hear her voice, soft and warm, as if she were still sitting across from him. He inhaled deeply, letting the scent of aged paper fill his senses. But instead of comfort, all he felt was weight. An invisible burden pressing against his chest. Why do we hold on to things long after they have served their purpose? Not just objects, but regrets, guilt, fear of moving forward. At 72, Thomas had spent a lifetime accumulating possessions, memories, even unspoken words that clung to him like shadows. And he knew he wasn't alone. How many of us keep things simply because we are afraid to let them go? A closet filled with clothes that no longer fit. A drawer stuffed with keepsakes we never look at. A heart weighed down by past mistakes, by words we wish we had said or actions we wish we had taken. But what if letting go wasn't about losing? What if it was about making space? Thomas thought of his old friend Robert, who had recently sold his house and moved into a smaller, simpler place. "I feel lighter," Robert had told him over coffee, his eyes brighter than they had been in years. "Like I can finally breathe again." At the time, Thomas had nodded politely, but now, sitting in his cluttered home, surrounded by objects that had once brought joy but now only gathered dust, he understood. Life was never meant to be a collection of things. He sighed, setting the letter back down. His gaze wandered across the room, past the old photographs and untouched furniture, past the books he no longer read and the souvenirs that no longer held meaning. Maybe it was time not to forget. Not to discard the love, the memories, or the life he had built, but to release the weight of what no longer served him, to create room, not just in his home, but in his heart. Because the truth was, Margaret wasn't in these letters. She wasn't in the porcelain figurines or the old postcards. She had been in their mornings together, in the laughter they had shared, in the way she had squeezed his hand during thunderstorms. And she was still here, not in the things she left behind, but in the love that remained. Thomas took a deep breath, his fingers brushing against the wooden chest once more. He didn't have to do it all at once. Maybe just one thing today. One small step toward lightness. Maybe today was the day he started letting go, and in doing so perhaps he would finally feel free. Letting go of physical clutter, freeing the mind. Thomas Carter stood at the entrance of his attic, staring into the dimly lit space that had been untouched for years. Dust clung to every surface, the air thick with the scent of time, of paper, yellowing in the darkness, a forgotten fabric of memories left undisturbed. The wooden floor creaked under his weight as he stepped inside, his fingers grazing the edges of old boxes stacked high against the walls. Each one held pieces of a life long lived, pieces of a past that still felt close enough to touch. His eyes settled on a wooden trunk tucked into the corner, its brass latches tarnished with age. He hesitated before crouching down, his hands shaking, slightly as he unlatched the lock and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, folded neatly on top of a pile of forgotten belongings, was a navy blue sweater. He exhaled sharply as recognition hit him, a wave of warmth and sorrow washing over him all at once. Margaret had knitted this for him nearly 30 years ago. He could still see her sitting by the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she hummed under her breath. She had worked on it for weeks, insisting that he needed something warm to wear in the winter. He had laughed at her then, teasing her that their winters were never that cold, but she had simply smiled in that knowing way of hers. "Just wait," she had said. "One day, you'll be grateful for it." He ran his fingers over the soft fabric, feeling the weight. of it in his hands, the weight of her love woven into every stitch. He held it to his chest, closing his eyes as if somehow in this quiet moment she might be there again. For a fleeting second, he could almost hear her voice, feel the warmth of her presence beside him. But as quickly as the memory surfaced, it faded, leaving behind the ache of longing that had become all too familiar. He opened his eyes and looked around the attic. Every item in this space told a story, a reminder of moments that had once been, but what had once been comforting now felt suffocating. It was as if he had surrounded himself with the past, afraid that if he let go of these things, he would somehow lose her all over again. But Margaret wasn't in these objects. She wasn't in the sweater, the old postcards, or the fragile china she had collected. She was in the mornings they had spent together, in the way she used to tuck her hand into his as they walked, in the love that still lived within him. He took a deep breath and folded the sweater carefully, with reverence, before placing it in a donation box beside him. It was a small step, but a necessary one. Letting go of this didn't mean letting go of her. It meant making space, not just in his home, but in his heart, for the life that was still ahead of him. As he worked through the attic, sorting through decades of possessions, he found himself letting go of more than just objects. He let go of the guilt he had carried for so long, the belief that holding on to things meant holding on to the people he had lost. He let go of the weight that had kept him stuck in a life that no longer fit. Some things he chose to keep, small, tokens that still brought him joy, but others he placed carefully into boxes, knowing they would find a new purpose beyond the dusty confines of his attic. When he finally stepped back, the space around him felt different. It wasn't empty, but it was lighter, as if the air itself had shifted, allowing something new to take root. The past would always be a part of him, but it didn't need to hold him captive. He looked out the attic window, watching as the afternoon. Light streamed in, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. It was the first time in years that this space had seen the sun. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt as though he could finally breathe. Letting go of toxic relationships, choosing love. Over obligation, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone that lay silent in front of him. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the worn, wooden surface. He knew it was only a matter of time before it rang. It always did. The same conversation, the same heavy feeling settling in his chest before he even picked up. Richard would call, as he always did, and Thomas would answer out of habit, out of some unspoken sense of duty. They had been friends for decades, if you could still call it friendship. In the early years, their conversations had been lively, filled with shared stories, dreams, and plans for the future. But over time, something had shifted. The warmth had faded, replaced by a constant undercurrent of criticism and negativity. Every call became a list of complaints about the world, about people, about life. And when Richard wasn't complaining, he was dismissing Thomas, belittling his choices, his thoughts, his feelings. "You still live alone?" Richard would scoff. "Must be miserable." At first, Thomas had brushed it off, telling himself that Richard was just blunt, that he didn't mean anything by it. But as the years went on, he began to realize something. Every time he hung up the phone, he felt drained, not uplifted. Their conversations left him feeling smaller, as if he had to defend his own life to someone who had stopped seeing him for who he truly was. And yet, he had held on. He had convinced himself that history was enough of a reason to keep answering, that friendship was about loyalty, even when it no longer felt like friendship at all. But lately, something inside him had started to shift. He thought of the afternoons he spent with Robert and the others at the cafe, conversations that were light, easy, full of laughter. He thought of the way he felt after spending time with them, energized, at peace. And then he thought of Richard, and how different it was. A garden choked with weeds, Margaret had once told him, would never allow flowers to bloom. Maybe she had been talking about her plants, but now Thomas wondered if she had meant more than that. The phone rang. Thomas stared at it for a long moment before finally reaching for it. He could already hear Richard's voice in his head, already feel the weight of the conversation before it had even begun. But as his fingers hovered over the button, Something in him resisted. What if he didn't answer? What if for once he chose his own peace over obligation? His heart pounded as he pulled his hand back, letting the phone ring until it fell silent. A few minutes later it buzzed with a message. "Call me back." But he didn't. Instead he stood up and walked to the door, stepping out into the fresh air. The sky was soft and blue, the scent of blooming jasmine drifting on the breeze. Across the street, Robert waved from his porch, a cup of coffee in hand. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before heading over. As he sat down, the conversation was easy, natural. They talked about simple things: the best place to buy fresh bread, the book Robert had just finished, the birds nesting in the tree overhead. There was no heaviness, no exhaustion, no need to defend himself, just warmth, just connection, and, in that moment, he knew he had made the right choice. Friendship wasn't about how long you had known someone. It was about how you felt when you were with them. It was about love, about care, about mutual respect. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas realized he had the power to choose. He wasn't losing anything. He was making room for relationships that felt light, for conversations that left him feeling whole instead of hollow. And as he laughed at something Robert said, the weight in his chest lifted, replaced by something far better. Letting go of regrets and self-blame. Embracing the present. The house was silent except for the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Thomas sat alone in his chair, staring at the flickering light of a candle on the table before him. It was late, but sleep had once again eluded him. Nights like these had become all too familiar, the quiet ones where memories came creeping in like shadows, whispering stories of what could have been. He reached for an old photo album, its leather cover softened by time. As he flipped through, the pages, the past came rushing back, frozen moments of laughter, of youth, of love. He stopped at a picture of himself and Margaret, taken on a bright autumn day nearly 40 years ago. They were standing by the lake, her hand resting gently on his arm, both of them smiling in the golden afternoon light. He remembered that day well. He also remembered what had happened just before the photo was taken. They had argued. It had been about something small. He couldn't even recall the exact words now, but he remembered the sharpness in his tone, the way her smile had faltered for a moment before she had brushed it off. The picture had captured their happiness, but not the tension that had lingered beneath it. And now, sitting alone in a quiet house, he wondered if he had wasted too many days like that, too many moments wrapped up in pride or impatience instead of choosing kindness. Regret settled in his chest, heavy and unrelenting. He had spent years carrying these thoughts, reliving the mistakes he could never undo. The words he should have said, the times he should have listened more, the moments he should have held on to longer. He thought of his children of the missed phone calls, the conversations that had been cut short because he had been too busy or too tired. He thought of opportunities he had let slip away, of dreams he had postponed for another time, a time that never came. How many people lived like this, carrying the weight of things they could no longer change, allowing regret to carve deep lines into their souls? He had met so many in his years who did, people who clung to past failures, who let their mistakes define them, who spent their days looking backward instead of forward. And now, sitting in the quiet of his home, Thomas wondered if he was one of them. He let out a shaky breath and closed the album. The past was gone, beyond his reach. No amount of regret could rewrite it. But the present, it was still here, still waiting. Margaret had always believed in embracing the moment. She had lived fully, without hesitation, without fear of looking foolish. She had danced in the kitchen while making breakfast, laughed loudly in theaters even when no one else did, stopped to admire flowers on the side of the road. She had known something that had taken Thomas far too long to understand. Life is not meant to be measured by the mistakes we've made, but by the moments we choose to live. Maybe it wasn't too late. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the night sky. The stars blinked softly against the darkness, distant yet constant. He thought about the time he still had, the people who still loved him, the things he could still do. He couldn't change yesterday, but he could decide how he lived today. Quiet realization settled over him. Regret had stolen too much time already. He would not give it another day. Tomorrow he would call his son, not just to talk, but to listen. He would invite his granddaughter over for lunch, not worrying about whether the house was perfectly clean. He would go to the park, feel the sun on his skin, and let himself enjoy the simple act of being alive. The past had shaped him, but it did not have to define him. As he blew out the candle, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that the best moments of his life might still be ahead of him. Letting go of unhealthy habits, treating the body as a temple. Thomas Carter sat at his kitchen table, staring at the half-eaten plate of food in front of him. A cold cup of coffee rested beside it, untouched. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, the kind of silence that felt heavier than noise. He used to enjoy meals. He and Margaret had always made a ritual out of them, setting the table, lighting a candle, savoring every bite. But in the years since she passed, food had become an afterthought. Some days, he skipped breakfast entirely. Other days, he ate whatever was easiest. Crackers, canned soup, a sandwich thrown together without much thought. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was just easier this way, and it wasn't just food. There were other habits, small but insidious, that had crept into his life over time. The way he sat for hours in front of the television, letting the news cycle repeat itself, each story more dire than the last. The way he stayed indoors more than he used to, convincing himself that the outside world no longer had much to offer him. The way he reached for his sleeping pills a little more often, finding it easier to drift into unconsciousness than to lie awake, thinking. He hadn't meant for it to happen, but bad habits never arrive all at once. They sneak in like shadows, settling into the spaces where energy and purpose used to be. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Robert standing there, dressed in his usual windbreaker, a pair of walking shoes on his feet. "Come on," Robert said, grinning. "It's too nice a day to waste inside." Thomas hesitated. He could think of a dozen reasons to say no. His knees ached, the air was a little too crisp, he had things to do, though he knew that was a lie. But something about the way Robert looked at him, expectant yet patient, made him pause. With a sigh, he reached for his coat. The park was quieter than he remembered. The trees stood tall, their leaves rustling gently in the autumn breeze. A few joggers passed by, a couple walked hand in hand, and further down, a grandfather knelt beside a child, showing her how to feed the ducks. Thomas inhaled deeply, feeling the cool air expand in his lungs. It had been a long time since he had simply breathed like this, without hurry, without distraction. "You know," Robert said as they walked, "when I first started doing this, I could barely make it down the block, without feeling winded." Thomas glanced at him. Robert had always seemed strong, steady, as if aging had barely touched him. "Really?" "Oh, yeah. After my wife passed, I let myself go. Didn't eat right, didn't move much. I figured, what was the point? But then I had a health scare. Doctor told me if I didn't start taking care of myself, I might not have much time left. That's when I realized I still wanted to live. Not just exist, but live." Thomas was quiet for a moment, letting the words settle. He thought about the meals he had skipped, the days he had spent doing nothing but sitting, the nights he had numbed himself into sleep rather than facing his thoughts. He had spent so much time grieving what was gone that he had forgotten to care for what remained, his body, his mind, his spirit. "Maybe I've been doing the same thing," Thomas admitted. Robert patted his shoulder. "It's never too late to start again." When Thomas returned home that evening, something inside him had shifted. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator, realizing that for the first time in a long time, he actually wanted a real meal. He cracked eggs into a pan, toasted a slice of bread, cut up a fresh apple. It was simple, but it was intentional, as Kay. He ate. He thought about all the small changes he could make. A short walk every morning, less time in front of the television, filling his head with noise, more meals that actually nourished him, maybe even reaching out to his doctor to see if he could finally sleep without the pills. He wasn't expecting a miracle, But maybe, just maybe, he could give himself the gift of treating his body not as something to be endured, but as something worth caring for. And perhaps, in doing so, he would remember that life, his life, was still something worth living, letting go of the fear of change, welcoming new beginnings. Thomas Carter sat in his living room, staring at the half-packed cardboard boxes scattered across the floor. The walls around him, once filled with photographs and framed memories, were now bare. His home, the place he had lived for over 40 years, felt unfamiliar in its emptiness. It was strange how quickly a space could transform when the things that made it feel like home were stripped away. He had told himself this was the right decision. His daughter, Emily, had been asking him for years to move closer to her and her family. "Dad, you shouldn't be alone," she had said, her voice filled with gentle concern. "It'll be easier for us to take care of you." He knew she meant, well, and perhaps she was right. The house had grown too big for just one person. The stairs felt steeper than they once had, the silence heavier. But still, something deep inside him resisted. Moving meant change, and change had always terrified him. For years, he had built his life around familiar routines. He woke up at the same time every morning, made his coffee the way Margaret used to, walked to the same cafe, sat in the same chair. It was comforting, predictable. But now, with each item he placed in a box, it felt as though he was erasing pieces of himself, as if he was stepping into a future that no longer had room for the past. He picked up a small ceramic bird from the coffee table. Margaret had bought it years ago at a street market, laughing as she insisted that every home needs a little piece of whimsy. He ran his fingers over its smooth surface, the weight of it grounding him for a moment. Would it belong in his new home, or would it become just another thing tucked away in a box, forgotten? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Robert stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, his familiar grin easing some of the tension in Thomas's chest. "Thought I'd check on you," Robert said, stepping inside. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the boxes. "Looks like it's really happening," Thomas exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, guess so." Robert sat down across from him. "You don't sound too sure," Thomas hesitated. "It's just this place is all I've known. It's where Margaret and I built our life. Moving feels like leaving it all behind." Robert was quiet for a moment before he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You ever watch birds?" he asked. Thomas blinked at the sudden change in topic. "What?" "Birds," Robert repeated. "You ever watch them build nests? They spend so much time making it just right, gathering twigs, weaving everything together. It's their home, safe, warm, but one day the time comes and they have to leave it behind, because if they don't, they never get to experience the sky." Thomas stared at him, the words settling into his chest, like a truth he had always known but never spoken aloud. For so long he had clung to the comfort of his home, afraid that stepping away meant losing what he had built with Margaret. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe love wasn't tied to a house, to walls and furniture, and memories trapped in objects. Maybe love was something he carried with him, something that could exist anywhere. He let out a slow breath and looked around. The room again. It wasn't the house that had made his life full. It was the people, the moments, the experiences. And those, he realized, didn't have to stay in one place. "Come on," Robert said, standing up. "Let's take a walk." Outside, the air was crisp, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. They walked in silence for a while, the sound of leaves crunching beneath their feet. Eventually, Robert spoke again. "You know, starting over isn't the same as forgetting," he said. "It's just another chapter, doesn't mean the last one wasn't important." Thomas nodded slowly, his heart a little lighter than before. That night, as he sealed the last box, he placed the small ceramic bird on top, not to be packed away, but to sit beside him in the car on the way to his new home. Because maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to embrace the sky. A life of lightness and freedom. The morning light poured through the window, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. The room felt different now, lighter, open, alive. Thomas stood in the middle of it, his hands resting gently at his sides. his gaze moving across the space that had once been crowded with things he no longer needed. The shelves were no longer overflowing, the corners no longer held forgotten objects gathering dust. What remained were only the things that truly mattered. For the first time in years, the house did not feel like a museum of the past. It felt like a home again. A soft breeze rustled the curtains, carrying the scent of fresh air, of something new. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, letting it fill his lungs, letting it settle into his bones. There was no weight on his chest, no invisible burden pressing down on him. He felt free. He walked to the window, his fingers grazing the wooden sill, and looked outside. The world stretched before him, unchanged, yet entirely different. The trees swayed gently, the leaves catching the sunlight in a way that made them shimmer. The laughter of children echoed from a distance, a sound he hadn't truly listened to in a long time. He smiled. Letting go had never been about losing. It had never been about erasing the past or discarding the love and memories he cherished. It was about making space, space for peace, space for joy, space for the life still waiting to be lived. He thought of Margaret, of the life they had built together, of the love that had never left him. She was not in the things he had given away. She was in the quiet moments of his heart, in the warmth he carried with him, in the way he chose to keep moving forward. The past could not be changed, but the present, it was his to shape. He turned away from the window, ready for whatever came next. If there was one thing he had learned, it was this: life was not about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go, and in that letting go he had found something he never expected: lightness, freedom, and the quiet joy of simply being. If you too long for a lighter life, perhaps today is the day to start. Maybe all it takes is one small step, one thing, one thought, one burden you no longer need. Let it go, and see what beautiful space it leaves behind.